26. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. I was looking at the schedule and I noticed that it seems to be way off. So I was wondering what time.
Yeah, right now you are live.
Okay. I can't seem to get my PDF up. So
So we will,
that
yeah,
would,
we will share from our side. Okay, no
okay.
problem.
Okay, but I
So
can move it, right?
yes, you can just say next slide so that our team will change
Okay,
the
but I'm
slides.
I'm jumping around, so I need to be am I not able to move it? Is that what you're telling me?
Yes, we are sharing from our side, right? So you need to let us know the second slide or third slide so that we can do it from our side.
All right, I'll give them the number. I guess that's the best we can do then.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for joining this Day 3 Summit, Deborah. So
Thank
hope you
you.
are doing great. And before you start your presentation, so I would like to introduce you to the audience. So yeah, Dr. Deborah is a keynote speaker. Dr. Deborah S. Greenhut is a keynote speaker, educator, and creator of the Narrative Competence Framework, dedicated to helping individuals strengthen identity, authenticity, and resilience through storytelling. With over 40 years of experience in higher education and leadership development, she has served as a college dean, Rutgers University professor, corporate trainer, and leadership educator. Through her speaking, writing, and podcast, Dr. Greenhut inspires personal growth, meaningful communication, and lifelong learning. So that is the introduction of Deborah S. Greenhut. So the stage is all yours. Before you start your presentation, our team will share the PowerPoint presentation. Just give us a moment, okay?
Thank you.
I hope you are able to see the PDF, right?
I am, yes, and I hope the audience can too. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Good luck.
Welcome, everyone, to Authoring Moments, recognizing your evolving identity through story. My name is Deborah Greenhut. May I have slide number 2, please? May I have the next slide, please? Something happened to me when I was 3 years old. I almost died in a room where a gas heater leaked. My mother will pick up the story from there. Let me share her version of it first. It was awful. Your grandparents made me go. They made me leave you in the room. And when we came back, it was terrible. You weren't breathing, and I had to drag you out of the room. And I finally got you out there. And I looked at you and I thought, how could you do this to me? How dare you almost die? Now, that version of the story controlled my understanding of that incident for almost 30 years. I felt uncomfortable and shamed by what I supposedly had done to my mother. When she would tell that story to guests in our home and other family members, and they seemed to find it uncomfortably amusing somehow. No one ever asked me how I felt about what happened in that room. I guess they knew my mother. There was often some laughter, and I didn't feel very good about it, but I let that discomfort go. I didn't know how to address it. Each time my mother told the story, it sent me back into helplessness. And it was a broken story for me for a long time. At 34 years old, I was sitting with my therapist who asked me to tell her how my mother expressed affection. I was stumped. My therapist pressured me. Surely you have a memory of that. Everyone does. I started to explain that all of those memories featured my father. No, she pressed. We need to hear about your mother. Was she scolding me? I wondered. Pressing on my people pleaser button, I, I tried to think of something, and she asked me again, tell me. I didn't. I couldn't. She asked me what I was resisting. Suddenly, the memory of that hotel room, the amber glow of the light, the Gas, the choking, my mother dragging me from the room, her brooch sticking into my face, all those images mounted in my head. And I didn't want to talk about it, though. It wasn't a memory of affection, it was violence. I just wanted to sleep. I believe my psychologist would be annoyed with my evasiveness, so I didn't share it, even though I knew beyond words that the gas heater moment was critical to what was bothering me that day. It was the way my mother expressed affection and bonding through criticism. My therapist pressed me. Didn't I remember a hug, a gesture? And finally, I blurted out, "She stole my story." Now, my mother's outrageous questions had shut down my feelings and my understanding of the event for almost 30 years. I almost died, and we were never going to talk about it that way. So many issues realigned in my head and my understanding about being hurt went underground. But once I began to unpack my meta story of my mother's meta story, the interpretations flowed like a waterfall for me. Could I have slide number 3, please? My mother could have made herself the hero. "I saved you," she could have said, giving me the feeling of being valuable, worth protecting. But my mother preferred to make me the villain. My mother could have made me the hero by saying, "Look how strong you were, you survived," giving me credit for strength or allowing me to feel powerful. But no, mom preferred to make me the enemy of her own weakness. Why? You might be asking yourself. You know how major life events often cause us to step up and finally assert an identity? Parents have a lot to do with our interpretations of early events, though. And these are, to my mind, authoring opportunities. So that incident has founded a lot of my thinking as an adult about how we need to help other people interpret theirs. See, we don't always take those authoring opportunities all the way to what I would call an authoring moment of interpretation due to situational pressures or our feelings toward others. It happened to me and it happens to everyone. Despite blaming other people for her lapse, my mother did come to my rescue. But her own backstory, a crushing fear of possibly losing a loved one, of being too late, was so great that she had to deny responsibility in order to overcome her own conflict. Stories can build us up or tear us down. We talk about resilience, but there's more. See, I need to tell you a little bit about my mother's backstory to explain why she said what she said, or at least I think so. My mother had to be the authority in every situation, the controller. And the way she asserted it, her own interpretation was often controlled by a version of the story of how her mother had died giving birth to her. Her own emotions about surviving and being abandoned, her birth led to both of those events, were so conflicted that she never felt comfortable taking responsibility. Her birth also broke up her family, and she was given to another family who adopted and raised her. When she actually met her biological sister about 10 years later, all the little girl could say was, "You killed my mother." That's a longer story for another time, something juicy for a therapist to unpack. But it says a lot about how my mother's childhood feelings and interpretation of her life must have gone south. Of course, at 3 years old, I didn't know all of that. My internal story of the event of my near asphyxiation was overwhelmed with fear and confusion for many years. And at 34, my mother's story had more coherence for me than my own. I had some work to do. I learned early on that my role in the relationship was to be compassionate no matter what she said, even to the point of eclipsing myself. I use myself as an example to open this talk because I teach people how to write about their experiences and derive meaning from their stories. I started my life as a freshman comp teacher, and I've worked my way up to narrative therapy and coaching people with their memoirs. This factor helps me to show and not just tell what I'm describing. This talk is not focused on the mother-child conflict, but it was the source of some of my ideas. The breath of air that I draw now from my experience sustains my talk about how to make constructive use of an authoring moment in your own life. Your identity is always developing through your interpretations, micro and macro, of the stories of your life. You can protect that process by noticing and actively authoring the meaning of your experience. Here's how I came to focus on authoring as the key to identity. I had remembered the event for 30 years. What I hadn't realized was that I was living inside someone else's interpretation of it. My mother's version became my version, and that edit changed who I believed myself to be. I believe that's why I became fascinated with other people's stories, not so much as entertainment, but as architecture, because stories don't simply describe our identity, they build it. Please skip to slide number 6. Developmental psychologist Robert Kegan argues that growth often occurs when we move from being the subject of our experiences to making them an object of reflection, interpretation, so that we can examine them rather than merely inhabit them. Kegan calls these transformative experiences authoring moments. I love that phrase, but after years of helping people write memoirs and examine the stories that shape them, I've come to believe there's an earlier stage that often determines whether an authoring moment ever happens. And I call that stage an authoring opportunity, as I just described it. An authoring opportunity is the moment life hands us a recognition of a story or part of one that could reshape who we become. An authoring moment happens only when we're actually able to make meaning from that experience for ourselves and then connect it back. When I was 3, I had an authoring opportunity. I almost died, but I wasn't allowed to author it. Someone else took that away from me. People who are stuck, we often say that they're operating from fear, but I think it's also a story block. They don't understand because they haven't been able to interpret what happened to them, so they feel stuck in a life that they didn't choose. I was in that position once, and many other people are as well. That's almost devastatingly simple. You know, it turns out, though, that psychologists have been studying this for decades. Research on narrative identity shows that human beings don't simply remember their lives. We organize them into stories. And those stories become the framework through which we understand ourselves, our relationships, and what's possible for our future. In other words, we don't merely have stories. Our stories have us until we learn to examine them. So the question becomes, if a story has been shaping me for years, how do I take back authorship? After coaching hundreds of writers and listening to thousands of stories, I found myself returning to the same 4 practices over and over to help others and myself. May I have slide 11, please? Okay, I think that's not the right one, but I'll continue and we'll go back. This 4-step framework that I just mentioned, each step begins with the letter N. First of all, notice what is happening to you. Become curious about the stories you tell automatically. How do you feel about them? What kinds of things do they evoke for you? The second step is N for name. Identify the interpretation that's hiding inside the facts. Or maybe there's not one. 3, the next N is for narrate. And the final step is for navigate. Decide consciously how that story will shape the person you become next. If we can go back to slide 3 now, please. Thank you. Reflecting on my own story, I noticed some possible variations that I mentioned to you. My mother could have said, I saved you. She could have told it as you survived. Instead, she said, look what you did to me. Those 3 variations, those versions, contain exactly the same facts, but only the meaning changes. And that makes all the difference. Depends on how we look at it. So interpretation is vital to how we understand our stories, not just the narrative facts, but what they actually mean to us. Slide number 4, please. My own research extends some points made by highly regarded scholars. For example, Dan McAdams, who spent decades showing that identity isn't simply personality or memory. It's the internalized life story we create to explain who we are and where we're going. Identity, he says, is an internalized and evolving life story. This psychologist argues that we don't simply remember our lives, we organize them into stories. And those stories become our identities, whether we allow gaps in our own interpretations or not. You can imagine what it might have done to me to not have any authorship over the story of the gas heater. See, we sometimes experience collateral damage from misinterpretation. In writers, this is particularly true. There are gaps in stories of some of my clients, and I have to remind them, well, it sounds like you might have had a response to what just happened to you. Why isn't it in the story there? So I try to coach people to examine and interpret and not simply narrate what has happened to them. It turns out that meaning probably matters more than events do. Research shows, let's have slide number 5, the next one. Research shows that how people interpret difficult experiences is going to affect and predict their later well-being much better than the objective event itself. So if you almost drown when you're swimming, you might have one reaction to it, and I might have another if it happened to me. So events are neutral. It's our interpretation that affects how we understand our lives. Researchers who have worked on this include Crystal Park, who focused on meaning making, and Susan Folkman, who looked at meaning focused on stress and interpretation and how they create a cycle. And George Bonanno looked at resilience from this lens. It isn't only what happens to us. Now, slide number 6, please. It's also the meaning of what happens. To go back to Keegan again for a moment, please don't change the slide. He moves from I am my story to I can imagine my story. Keegan calls these developed, as I mentioned before. These are authoring moments in his explanation. I believe many of those stories, those moments, begin as what I call authoring opportunities, which we are free to take on or not, depending on the pressure on us in a situation. Research by McAdams, Habermas, Luke, Prosopati, and others shows that people who develop coherent life narratives generally experience stronger psychological well-being, stronger identity, and greater resilience. Greater narrative coherence is also associated. May I have slide number 7, please? Greater narrative coherence in how your story holds together is also associated with psychological well-being, resilience, and a stronger sense of yourself. Turning now to James Pennebaker, who claims that writing helps organize experience. Pennebaker demonstrated that putting emotional experiences into language can improve both psychological and physical outcomes for people. And that leads us naturally to teaching and interpretation. And that's why I ask my writing students of all ages, not just what happened, but what they now understand about it. And I would say college freshmen are particularly vulnerable here because they haven't thought about it before. Yet the first 10 essays that most colleges ask of students, if they're still asking for essays, will involve their forming opinions about their experiences and that's often why students remain adrift. We can also look to resilience as drawing from psychological flexibility and from well-being. Stephen Hayes, who wrote about acceptance and commitment therapy, suggests that psychological flexibility predicts resilience better than rigid attachments to thoughts. In other words, we suffer less when we can hold our stories enough to revise them. Take an objective look. What I think my work adds is helping people to recognize the moments before transformation, the moments when life hands us an experience or a memory that could become part of our identity if we try to understand it, but it might be a block right now. To put it another way, we are shaped by the stories we inherit. We are healed by the stories we author, though. Using narrative therapy techniques when I coach story writers, what I do is work through people's stories with them and notice the gaps, the potential authoring moments. What did you feel like when this happened? I'm frequently going to say when something like that, or the student expresses the emotions, I might say to them, well, there seem to be some feelings missing here. Is there anything else you want to add to this story? I try not to bring my own emotions into it. Sometimes that can't be helped, but the student will usually resist and say, no, I felt this. So it's a good dialogue where the interpretation becomes more clear. Coaching stories is not just about what happened next for me. Existing research tells us that stories shape identity and that meaning matters. May I have slide number 8, please? Coherent narratives also predict well-being, and authoring transforms your development. Being able to become an expert at your own story is critically important to your well-being. What my work adds is helping people recognize the moments before transformation, the moments when life hands us an experience that could become part of our identity, but isn't quite clear to us through interpretation. May I have slide number 9, please? As I said, I call those authoring opportunities. Kagan, for example, describes how adults develop, and McAdams describes how identity is organized. And as a reminder, Pennebaker explains how language processes experience, and narrative psychologists explain why coherence matters. If you look back at the story I told about myself, all of the things were prevented for me by another person, my mother, who needed to have her own narrative coherence. And it seems like if we are stressed enough or hurt enough, we will work to defend that as hard as we can. And I was no match for it. Now, it says a lot that there are stories that circulate about how people survived during wartime, possibly one of the most challenging human event stories that people might have to live through. So let me give you an example from Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham, who researched how young children coped with the Blitz. So if we can go to the next slide, please. They noticed that children's adjustment depended greatly on trusted caregivers' interpretations of what was going on. That the children who survived emotionally the best were the ones who weren't so worried about the bombing and the sounds and the noise, but who were handled by caregivers who interpreted this as something temporary, as something that could be survived, and the children picked up on what the adults had to say. And I think this is crucial to what I was struggling with myself for 30 years. As most children do, I borrowed my mother's interpretation before I could form my own. I didn't have a choice about it, but that's what children do. And looking back at my own situation, there's an echo of this research from Freud and Burlingham, which I didn't discover till a whole lot later. It was only natural that I had adopted or co-opted my mother's interpretation of the gas heater situation. My mother wasn't frightened by the gas heater so much as frightened that I would die, but I was frightened by what was going on in the room at that moment. She was triggered by her past, and that past became my context for understanding what happened to me. She interpreted it for me perhaps in an attempt to prevent me from suffering too much. But the things she said did not take me in that direction. For 30 years, I lived inside her box of interpretation until one day I didn't. There's an inverse apocryphal story running around the internet about an incredible Mary Poppins-like nanny who realized that children could be harmed if they understood what was going on during the war, and they found themselves inside a bombing raid. And she spoke to them as if it was a great adventure that they were going to be on, finding their way home, and they ran, excited by the chase. And they got home and they were none the worse for it. There's no evidence that this nanny ever existed, but she's probably drawn from that story by Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham's research. And it's the kind of story that is really helpful to explain how children cope when there's an emergency going on. It's all due to the adults around them and how they respond. So the teaching point of the story, if an adult were to react with fear, the child is more likely to experience it. If the adult reacts with calm or curiosity, the child is more likely to regulate successfully. This is one of the foundational mechanisms by which interpretation is transmitted across generations. As a 3-year-old, I quite literally depended on my mother to tell me what happened. She woke me from a sound sleep, which was almost more sound than it ever should have been, given the gas leak, and she dragged me out of a room without a lot of explanation. When I was a 3-year-old, someone else interpreted my experience. At 34, I could examine that. Slide number 11, please. I couldn't change the facts and I couldn't change my mother's story, but I could decide whether I could continue living in it. I noticed that something was amiss in the telling of that story. At 34, I was finally able to name it. I was the one who nearly asphyxiated, not my mother. I was the one who was nearly killed, if we want to go back to my aunt's extreme statement. I was the one who needed to retell the story from my point of view and to navigate toward a better understanding of it for me. Slide number 12, please. I couldn't change my mother's story, but I could decide whether I would continue living inside it. I would continue to resent my mother for co-opting of my stories, for always saying, I will live through you, and trying to take them away from me. I could understand that my mother really never moved out of that childlike state where she herself needed the story to go a certain way in order to feel safe in her own bones. Looking back, we can say the adults in my mother's story were not very good at providing calm either, and that's an understatement. This is what I mean by an authoring opportunity. Life hands us event experiences every day. Some are joyful, some are heartbreaking, and some leave us with stories that we never consciously chose. The opportunity isn't to change what happened. The opportunity is to become the author of what it means. As you leave today, I'd simply invite you to ask one question. Is there a story you've been living with inside that now invites another reading so you could find new meaning? Because the stories that shape our lives are rarely finished. They're waiting for the next interpretation, for your next authoring. It took a very long time, but our story is not anyone else's. I made amends with my mother because I began to understand what interpretation could do. Our story became a lot different to me again 10 years later when she died. And I find myself going back to it because it's a signal experience for me as I try to help people with their own stories of how you always have the right to reinterpret what happened. Maybe not other people's stories, but you do have the right to interpret your own. My mother was trapped in a version of her story handed to her by her sister, and she almost succeeded in passing that generational wound to me without ever meaning to. I don't think she could help herself. And we could say that's not an excuse, and it was pretty hurtful. But we could also say that she never found the solutions that I've been able to search for in my adult life since that moment on the therapist's couch where I realized I was the one who needed to pick up my own story. It was my responsibility. My mother also wanted me to have what she couldn't have, an education, which gave me the knowledge and flexibility she could not achieve. That is no small thing. Next slide. Identity is not an object you pick up and apply to yourself. It's your organic and pliable experience of the world, which is interpreted through your stories. May I have the next slide, please? I want to thank you. Questions and comments are welcome. I'm finishing my book, Authoring Moments, I hope this fall, so I hope you will search for it. And these are some ways that you can connect with me. There are contact forms on my websites, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing the inspirational and motivational presentation today. And if you want to reach Deborah, yes, you can reach out to our website. It's www.deborahgreenhut.com and www.collegeidentityspeaker.com. And so, yes, there were multiple questions asked by the audience. So, here is the question. What does is truly mean to take back the pen in your own lives?
Take back the pen can either mean to write it or narrate it somehow, get it out there so that you can actually review the story. Other people may have been writing your story for you, choosing for you, deciding which path you should follow. Some people's parents like to tell them they must be a lawyer or a doctor or a secretary or a nurse or whatever it happens to be. The pen is yours. There may be obstacles, there may be conflict, but if you don't follow your true identity, you're living someone else's version of your story. So I would say get back in there with a red pencil and edit what is going on so you have control and agency over your own life.
Yes, yeah, you're right. I completely agree with your answer. And so here is the second question from the audience. So, how do we know if we are living inside an old story that no longer serves us?
I think the best way to know is that you suddenly feel conflicted about a version of the story that you're hearing or listening to, or someone else is telling your story. I've often found in my life that people will tell my story and they put their own spin on it, their own emphasis on what it means. And I feel myself saying, no, that's not what it means to me. So if you feel that kind of glitch where no, this is not right, that's the moment at least to examine it for yourself. You don't have to contradict the other person, but go home then and sit down and write it out and say, well, what really happened here, or what are some other possibilities, and experiment with those, see if any of those fit instead. I think you recall my mother could have said, you great survivor, you got through this, and I would have felt so different about what had just happened to me, but she chose what she chose. And for a long time, I lived with that. And my therapist, who is very wise, picked just the right question to ask me about affection. And I couldn't think of anything until I thought of this. And it wasn't the right answer, but it was the answer.
Wow, really, you're a great achiever and you're a strong woman. And thank you so much. And we are so honored that you're a speaker for this Global Virtual Summit 2026. And definitely, yeah, so many people will take something from this presentation and they will reach you personally as well. And so, thank you so much for joining. And we want your support and love for the upcoming speakers and the conferences as well. And please do join our next sessions. Thank you, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, Melinda.
Thank you. Bye bye.